Hi, folks. So welcome to our fireside chat without a fire on what it actually takes to start a security product company. And the reason we titled that is that I think a lot of folks here do services, and we found that products are a little different. I'm Bob Stratton. I'm one of the partners at the Mach 37 Accelerator, which is a business accelerator for security startup companies. This is my partner, Rick Gordon. Just by way of background, we are guys who have done a variety of different startup companies, product companies, and service companies. We've also done work on the investment side with the venture capital community. And more recently, what we do is invest in folks that may just have a good idea and help them build a company around that and take it out. By way of background, I stood up security at one of the first commercial ISPs, was at one of the first network IDS startups, had a pen testing company before pen testing was cool, and sold that. Used to do venture deals for a thing called InQtel and ran a lab at Symantec. Rick?
Can you guys hear me? Test 1, 2. Much better? This is going to be awkward. Just by way of background, I started my career in the military, spent a little time on Wall Street, and then caught an entrepreneurial bug, and not by training, but more by happenstance, got into the information security industry with my first startup. I moved back to Virginia from New York, and got into a little business called Tabaris that was building an SMTP encryption gateway at the edge of the network, and my job was decidedly not technical. I think I was the least drunk person in the room, and they needed a CEO, and I was the one that was foolish enough to say, well, I can do that. And learned perhaps the hard way how to raise capital, how to operationalize a concept, and build a team around that. I've been in and out of that industry. I'll talk a little bit about that and perhaps in a minute. Have run multiple companies that are in the information security arena, and was fortunate enough to, with Bob, join Mach 37 about 16, 17 months ago. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There's at least one veteran I know that has raised capital and probably have scars to show for that as well. Mark, nice to see you. And I know Marcus is part of our accelerator here, so you're learning right now as you go. Anybody else here ever raised capital in the hunt for capital, have an idea they want to raise capital for, and create a business around? Okay, so why is everybody here? So I think what Bob is going to talk a little bit about is, or what we would like to talk a little bit about is, how do you do that? How do you, if you have a really disruptive idea for a security product, how do you actually take that idea and make a huge contribution to the status quo in information security by productizing it and getting it out there into the market and used by hopefully everybody?
I think that's about right. And so the reason you hear us say the word product a lot, and there's a challenge that I went through a couple of different times in the course of my career where I was working really hard on fixing things, and in the course of doing that, sometimes we'd build something that was really helpful or useful for us, whether that was within a company or within a consulting practice for one customer or something. And I would think about this and I would say, we can't possibly be the only people who have this problem. This thing could be useful to a lot of other people, but we sort of weren't thinking about, and this has happened to me in a number of companies, we weren't really thinking about what else we could do with it, or we were thinking about, does it hurt me competitively if I somehow help other people have this capability? And the good news is, I think that the development of open source projects, the way it's played out, has made that a little better. I think a lot of us are more willing and think more automatically about how to share useful things that we've come up with people to help them do their job too. But one of the things that always sort of vexed me when I was consulting was that I just didn't scale. You know, my whole life was about doing things for customers, and I only had so many hours in the day, and what I find is there's this trade-off that you run into, and this is really what kind of the root of some of what we want to talk about, is that you can be a consultant and you can be the best consultant in the world at a particular thing, and you can solve really hard problems, but you're probably doing it for one customer at a time. And at the end of the day, if you are the best at what you're doing, for example, and you do have these ideas, wouldn't you really like to be able to fix more stuff than one at a time? And so the question becomes, how do you do that? And I think that I will argue that most security products that have been most popular, that have done the best, that have been the most useful, generally involve embodying expertise into an object. Incompletely, imperfectly, admittedly, but when you can embody some aspect of your personal expertise into a thing, two things happen. One is you can make copies of that thing and put it in more places and help more people. And the other is you can earn money when you're asleep. And this, we don't always think this way, right? But there is a way to work that involves doing a thing, reproducing it multiple times, and doing well because of that, just because it's out there and continuing to go out there. And this involves, of course, building a company to do this. But the point being that you can reproduce the object many, many times. There will still be a need for expertise. There will still be a need for professional services and things like that. But if you have a vision or a thing that really bugs you in the industry that you're trying to fix, I invite you to think about that. Like, how can I be in more places than one? And one of the ways you do that is by embodying your expertise into a thing. And the challenge for this is that in the services world, if you're good, and I'm going to assume that most people coming here, if they have the interest to come here, are probably good at what they do. It's pretty, I don't want to say it's easy to make money, but you can find people who need your skills, who are willing to engage you to come in and do something, and that can be a pretty good gig and a lot of fun. And you might even get to the point where you're a lifestyle consultant. You know, you've got a company, it does what you need, you're doing your thing. You get to be the smart person who gets called occasionally to solve a hard problem. And that is comfortable. And I mean, it may be hard work, and you may not always be having fun, but for the most part, it's comfortable. The challenge with embodying your expertise into a product is that it's expensive. It costs money to do this. It takes time, and it requires some patience that you don't necessarily have to have. And correct me if you think I'm off base here, that you don't necessarily have to have when you got people calling you up, say, come be smart for me.
So you say patience, I would say risk tolerance. Just real quickly, without putting forward an advertisement for Mach 37, one of the fundamental reason that we were created was that there was a hypothesis that this region in particular was full of this intellectual capital, full of talent, of people that were principally in the services industry, either they're serving the intelligence community, they're serving commercial enterprises in this region, or serving other federal customers. Many of you, probably more so than anywhere else on the planet, you understand cybersecurity or information security. If you go back more than 5 years, you understand the threat, you understand how it gets into your network, where the artifacts of the compromise may exist, how you aggregate those, and with intelligence processes, how do you raise the signal-to-noise ratio to know when you've been and then ultimately
do about that? So there's a lot of this intellectual capital around this region, but less so around how do you implement a good product management process in your commercial enterprise. How do you validate that a market exists for your product as opposed to demand from one customer that you might be serving at the time? How do you build a business at a price? How do you price your product if you have to support a direct sales force and all of whom want to be making 200 ad plan or 250 ad plan and then above? And so what does that kind of business look like? There's less of that in this region, perhaps than you would see in other places on the West Coast. Now, just to give you one anecdote, I actually did some time with a company that just made an acquisition of a West Coast SIM business, and this company that was acquired, was the East Coast acquired it, had its DNA within the intelligence community. So they had this expertise that we're talking about. What was just remarkable to me that this West Coast very well funded SIM company, where they actually used that databases. It was a wicked scalable columnar database. So think about the benefits of that and looking at raw data. But nobody on that particular team understood what questions to ask the SIM, what are the queries we could run, because they didn't know where the artifacts were compromised and frankly might exist. So we believe that this area, we actually believe it's easier to take those softer skill sets. How do you, let me say it more fundamentally. We can take individuals that have domain expertise that they've built in this region and have terrific product vision because they're solving real problems with what they envision, and then wrap around them those softer skill sets that may be less abundant in this region such as product management, such as sales and marketing to large commercial enterprises, such as how do you build strategic relationships and build channels. Those are things that we believe individuals like you all can learn really quickly, whereas technical skill sets you develop take a decade or more to build, which is fundamental premise of our investment strategy and the kinds of entrepreneurs that we're looking for. Bob will often say this, we're probably looking for entrepreneurs that may not know they're entrepreneurs yet. These are individuals that are technologists that have enough domain expertise to have created some disruptive innovation that can solve a vexing problem. They just aren't aware of the fact that there's a big opportunity for them from a business perspective. And so hopefully we can eliminate that for them.
And so, one of the things we want to do is that if folks have questions about how this works or there are some things that we know that the people in the Valley talk about all the time over, like in the grocery store line, but around here, they're maybe not as common topics around investment and term sheets and Series A rounds and things like this. But one of the things we want to do is that if folks have questions about how this works, that we want to be available to answer those. But Rick makes really, I think, the fundamental point that I've even in the course of doing what we've been doing for the last 15 months or so, talked to some people who have said, I never would have used the term entrepreneur to apply to myself, but I find myself running a business now, and sometimes it's conference businesses, sometimes it's consulting businesses, and so you may find that some of the skills that you're already using all the time are directly translatable to this other stuff. And I guess where I really think that this becomes fun is when you look at the security problem writ large and you look at areas that you feel aren't being served, this is the mechanism that allows you to change that. So one of the things, just to give you a little sense of how we look at the world right now, that we were thinking about in light of some of the recent breach, or not so recent breach news. When you look at, we've been doing the security enterprise product thing for a while. I was at an IDS company that Cisco bought some years ago, and I've sold into those markets, and I've put products into, created products for those markets. Everybody's selling to the same 2,000 customers. Like, you go look at the Fortune 1000 or the Global 2000, every enterprise security product in the world says, we're going to go sell to those. And they almost always start by saying, we're going to sell to the banks. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that there are 14 million other companies that are not those. And they may, small may be hard to get into, but medium is a ridiculously broad range of people who do not, for the most part, have solutions being built for them or targeted for them by most of the vendors. There are a handful of vendors, and you know who they are, because if you turn the radio on, WTOP in the morning, you hear radio commercials for one in particular. But if you think about who's actually directly making products to solve really hard security problems the way we do in the enterprise world for the mid-market, there are like 5. I mean, maybe there are more, but you know what I think if you know the space, there are people that do hardware firewalls, and there are people that do some anti-spam appliances and things. But for the most part, there's this huge market that people have not crafted products for, and yet we hear that big retailers get hacked because someone went into their heating and air conditioning contractor. I'm betting their heating and air conditioning contractor may not be a Fortune 1000 company. I don't know. It's a hypothesis, right? So one question is, if you actually want to fix the security problem, is there an opportunity maybe to make a company with a thing that addresses the problems of those customers? And if you were to do that, would that be a crowded space? You know what? It might not be. You might have a lot of opportunities. So that's just one, that's how we sort of couple solving the hard problems to this business stuff in a way that I think is tangible and helps us think about companies that might have some real opportunity. Another space more recently that we've been spending more time in, and in our current crop, we have some folks are trying to do things for developers. That's a hard market. You can look at folks that were doing source code scanning and stuff, and they've had it's taken a while to kind of get traction in some of those spaces. But you can't deny that there are things that we could do better, security-wise, for developers. Maybe it's how I use encryption. Maybe it's how I scan my code. The point being that if you want to solve those problems because they annoy you, or because you see a huge set of people with those, you can start a company and you can address that, and you might be the person with the expertise to actually do that. And it may not be, it's going to be a challenge. The challenge is different. So versus the enterprise market, the challenge in the mid-market is there are a whole bunch of people that you have to find for customers. There are just more of them, and they're spread out, and they're not as consolidated. So there are other ways to do that, like channel strategies and resellers. And
well, I think in Bob's in writing, probably our biggest investment thesis is finding those solutions that if they can solve the problem in the big market influence. Garver said that the global security market is roughly 74 billion growing a year, so something like that. Probably more than that right now. The big market are relatively untouched, and a lot of it is because the delivery mechanism or the channels to get to the big market just aren't mature enough. If we are, go try to sell a more advanced security product through an ISP is hard. I mean, they're not equipped, their sales organization are equipped to do it very well. But when you do it once, or you do it a couple of times, and you can demonstrate the effectiveness So I mentioned I got into the information security industry around 1999, and then I can recall honestly getting out of it in 2002. You guys, many of you were probably in the industry around that time. If you remember, it really sucked. It was hard. We just had an economic downturn. There was no discretionary spending at the large enterprise level, and really difficult to make money. And a lot of us were flocking to federal, and various companies did the same thing. And got into homeland security for a while, and then found myself not being able to come back. Probably around 2004, 2005, because it's just frankly, more interesting. I would say the market is just different right now. And I try to sort of identify what those things are that make it different. But it's just quite honestly one of the most exciting spaces to be in from an investor perspective. And I think one of the key reasons that it's different is that it's just a Main Street issue now. I mean, it's not just in dark reading that you're reading about, hacks. It's the Wall Street Journal, it's the New York Times, it's the Washington Post. Main Street is aware of the problem and they hear about it. What that's doing, from our estimation, is opening up opportunities for innovation that addresses the problem of everybody from the Fortune 2000 and below. And so we are spending a lot of time trying to figure out who to invest in to solve those problems, because we believe, if you're familiar with the medical white space, we believe that's where the white space is. That's where the competition is not, and our companies can be successful. And by the way, there are two of our entrepreneurs are here: Marcus Carey from Cardinal Me and Josh Marquette from the Joe here. Hopefully we can get to some Q&A and maybe those guys can answer questions.
So one question for the folks here. I'm trying to divide some bins here. How many folks work for themselves or for a small shop? Okay, good. How many folks work for a really big company? Okay, so it's a good mix. Yeah, he beat me to it. I spent the entire 1980s for me were largely consulting. And the great aspect of that, and the reason I actually encourage people to do it, is I got to be inside commercial, military, federal, civilian, federal, and academic customer environments. And I learned a tremendous amount in each of those, which became useful later. So there is a lot of good stuff you can get, even to understand how they decide what to go buy or how they solve problems. But I came to the realization that small is more fun. And so how many of you have ever thought about, how many of you have a thing that you've been thinking would be really useful for a whole bunch of people and maybe have built or are thinking about releasing an open source project? Wow.
That's awesome.
That's excellent. So you're already helping things get better.
Can I ask you a question? Okay, just for Brave Soul. What's holding you up? You raise your hand.
One of the things that often holds up myself and probably other people who do services work is you have a great idea that would solve more than just the immediate problem, but you have to pay the bills. And so something like an accelerator that could give you enough seed money to take time off from your day job and do a little work for a couple of months to see your little inkling of an idea turn into something. Maybe it flops, or maybe it looks like you can really go somewhere.
Can I respond to that? And I'll go. Here's what I think about that. We started out the accelerator about, like I said, a little over a year ago, and we sized our initial investment as $25,000 investment. And by the way, the amount of money that we give, we take an equity percentage in the business that we're investing in. It really is not. It's really, the percentage that we take is really based on the value we create. It has less to do with the amount of money that we're giving. The $25,000 attract into entrepreneurship was these were West Coast, fresh out of undergrad entrepreneurs. These were individuals that had families, they had car payments, they had mortgages, some had kids in college. These are, real honest to God, people that have financial responsibilities that we dealt with. We took just a very small increase in the amount of equity that we were claiming based on the additional money. But we think that was the right thing to do because of that reason. Yes, you're successful. You're running successful businesses, and what you had an idea that we like. We needed to make it compelling enough for you to actually take that leap.
Or for some of the other people who raise their hands to the large company, you have an established career and a stable path and hopefully well compensated. So taking the leap to say I'm going to quit my guaranteed day job for life to put my house at risk.
All I can do is encourage you guys, just personally.
You have a guaranteed day job?
No, I didn't raise my hand for the large enterprise.
What's that?
I did not raise my hand for the large enterprise question, but people who feel like they're comfortable, stable, especially
Here, what's that
here.
company you work for these days? If you have a guaranteed day job, I bet you it's 100 people who love to work with you. These days, guarantee doesn't exist, let's be honest.
Yeah, Josh is the quietest guy we have. It's hard to get him out of his shop.
Define opportunity cost.
Money that you can make doing something else. We're asking our entrepreneurs to give us 3 months of their time. And while there's some flexibility in for them to do other things, it's hard work, right? It's a 24/7 job starting a business, and so we take 80% of the companies, and so that's not nothing. And that, if you ask us what keeps us up at night, it's thinking about how do we earn that back, and make sure that entrepreneurs feel like they got a hell of a lot more than 8% in value for their businesses when they leave. And so they can't do much else. We'll just put it that way. We typically look for 2 entrepreneurs. Some exceptional people can do it with 1, but it's just a lot of work, right, Marcus? Yeah. And so you got to cover that.
So, I mean, there are, and I think you covered a lot of the reasons that kind of hold people back. And I'm not going to say that it's trivial. In fact, what I'll say is it's hard, and it may be the hardest thing you've ever done, but it's going to be hard in different ways than you're used to. It's even harder. So the analogy, this is an imperfect analogy, and I'm still working this one through, but I've been trying to use this deer hunting analogy, and I was trying to compare my life in the federal world and my life in the product startup world. And it's like, kind of when you're doing some of the federal business, the deer sends you a letter and says, on this day at this time, I'm going to be in front of this tree, but you only get 1 arrow. And if you miss, you might be able to complain and get another arrow, but, so you can say, is that easy? No, it's not, because you might miss. The commercial world is different. There are a whole bunch of deer, but a bunch of them are like rabbits in deer costumes, and you have to sort out which ones are real and which ones aren't. Yeah, it's a terrible analogy, but the point being that it's hard in different ways, And one of the things that we find is like, if you're doing services, you can pick a whole bunch of different kinds of structures for the company. You could be a sole proprietor, right? You could just be you. You could be an LLC, which I think is probably what a lot of the majority of them are. You can be this thing called a subchapter S, which is a corporation, except that it's kind of really you, and some of the tax stuff goes straight to you, and it's simpler. But the subchapter S has all these limits on if you ever were to have investors, how many you can have, and things like that. Then the one that most, big co would be, are subchapter C. Those things actually turn out to matter way more, I would say, when you're trying to do a product company And the reason is not so much about product, it's that to get into the market with a product company is expensive. And it requires, usually that's why, and I will say, and I think Rick will echo me on this, we are not saying, by the way, that everybody in the world should always be getting outside investment from institutional investors for their companies. I love bootstrapping and building my company out of my own revenue, and by God, if I have people willing to pay me, why wouldn't I do that? But you know what? It's expensive enough to get a product into the commercial market that you may have to get some investment from somewhere else. And so it turns out that when you have outside people who are in the business of investing you, things like what form of company you use really matters. So it turns out that the ones that are simpler for one person to use are actually harder for investors to invest in. So you have to be conscious of that. And that winds up being, I think, for purposes, like when we bring somebody in, sometimes they don't have a thing yet, sometimes they do. Sometimes they have a big company and they're spinning it out into a little company. That there are these mechanics that matter. And it's not that they're intrinsically better. It's that the rules that are set up around them require you to be cognizant of the fact that, like, the IRS says, you know, if you're a subchapter S, you can't have more than so many investors. So you're never going to have, if you start one of those, you're never going to have a venture investor invest in you without making you change what your company is anyway. Which costs money.
So there were some other questions or some other reasons what's looking at.
Yeah, so I think other reasons, at least for me, it's also being able to judge if there's a market for your product. And
great.
Also knowing people that, so for instance, I might have a great idea, but I don't necessarily have the expertise to execute that idea, and needing to get people who have those expertise and sort of give them that idea, help get them to run with it. So I think those are two other things that sort of prevent people from doing that. And I don't know if that's something before you even get to the investment part that you need to figure out, or
So this is something you need to resolve before you get to us. It's something you need to resolve before you get to an institutional VC. If you're going to build a security product company, there of course are exceptions, but almost all of you will require institutional venture because it's so expensive and they keep quiet. The issue around not being certain that there's a market there. I believe that you could probably get angel investment demonstrating that there are a handful of customers that want what you have. I believe you can't get venture money unless you can demonstrate that there is an actual or there was a market. You validated that there's a market for what you have. And that's in one, understanding who the buyers are, understanding why they want what you have, with real anecdotes, with a statistically relevant sample of interactions with prospective buyers. There may be reasons they haven't bought it yet. Maybe they're waiting to see the maturity of the product, or they're waiting to see the maturity of the company. You'll get that a lot. But all of that, validating that the market exists. So knowing how big it is, how much it's growing, who they are, how many there are, and how you're going to get to them, are all things that we focus hard on.
And just to give you a sense, there's a sort of a continuum in terms of validation that you can get from outside parties that it becomes helpful when you're talking to investors. So kind of at the most basic level is somebody out there in the real world doing a real job who's willing to say, this is a useful thing and would probably solve a problem I have. And if they let you quote them on a slide, so much the better, even if they're not trying it yet and even if they're not paying you. The next is somebody who says, I'm willing to try your thing in my real world environment and I'll give you some feedback, but I'm not going to pay you yet. I'll do a pilot and kind of see. And then there's, and this is the big dividing line, there's somebody who says, I'm willing to try this out in my real world environment and I'll pay you something. So the interesting thing here is that that something doesn't have to be a lot. It just has to be provable. So your first install for a useful thing could be a 90% discount for your first pilot customer, but it's still a paid pilot. And when you talk to the angel investors, that is sort of the minimum place where you really start to be able to get some things done. If they're willing to pay you something less than a 90% discount, obviously it's better. But all of those are helpful. And there are other things you can do too. We can talk about this to accrete value around your company.
One of the things that we've done is aggregated a network of mentors that are, some of whom are buyers, some of whom are industry analysts, but that do know, or at least should know, that there's a market there and can facilitate those interactions with prospective customers for you, so that you can ask that question. And that maybe the answer is, yeah, I'd like that, or no, the dog doesn't run, or I'd like it if, and then you pivot a little bit. This is the iterative nature of
Pivoting is
change the direction of my product. I might do something different. I discovered a new value for what I built that I didn't anticipate ahead of time. Yes.
Just to give a personal note, when I came in the door, Mach 37, I had a list of people I was going to be selling to that has not only turned 180 degrees and changed and gone in 14 different directions, but they were like, it's cool, and they helped me hunt down the people that could validate which directions I needed to go in. It's totally changed when I started it. It's okay.
and I don't want to make this a commercial, but Josh, makes a good point. When you get real world feedback, one of the things you'll discover is that, and you're asking exactly the right question, like what is the market? The problem you think you're solving may in fact not be the problem that the market really wants solved, but you might be the closest person to it. And so one of the other hard things, because I don't ever want to make this look easy, one of the other hard things is you have to balance your resolute focus that you've got something that's really good and going to make a difference and going to change the world and be useful to people, with a willingness to receive input from outside that tells you that one of your underlying assumptions isn't right. And it's really hard to balance that, because you have to be confident that you're doing something that's important and that people need it. But you also have to be willing to listen to your universe and change and adapt. So I have no idea what the best analogy is. There's probably some naval one with steering a boat, but you're trying really hard to get to this. You're on a heading and you're trying to get to this place, but you may have to go around some sandbars and stuff. And that is a thing the good news is it comes, and it mostly comes from what Rick talked about, which is talking to people. So right now, today, if you have a good idea, I will tell you, most people hurt themselves more by being too, especially in this industry, by being too cagey and conservative and paranoid about talking about what they think is important and what they want to solve, than just talking to people who might be able to say, yeah, I have that problem and I would love it if you did that. When can I try it? We're so paranoid that somebody's going to rip us off, that we don't want to talk. And I think a lot of us, depending on what communities we came out of, our nature might be not to talk. You have to talk to people, and talk to your trusted colleagues, talk to your personal mentors, and just kind of bounce it off people, because in the early stage, a 15-minute conversation can change the entire trajectory of your company in a good way. Does that help?
Yeah, I think you also answered the other question about how to find people with expertise to how to find people with expertise to sort of help you execute your idea is, I guess you just have to talk to people and see, how they may be able to help you with that.
So, just dumb things down too much, but yeah, building a network or leveraging a network is really important. And that's something that we recognize that for our companies that when they're coming in, they may not have. And so we open ours up, our members open theirs up, and that's really the kind of ecosystem that already exists at Palo Alto. I mean, we probably interact with that as the gold standard, but it kind of is. We're trying to build that here so that if there's an area of expertise that you need, then you're moving your separation away from that. I will say what we try to facilitate with our entrepreneurs is a vision of what that business is supposed to be. So meaning, there's an exercise that's important for I think you to run through, which is, okay, this is where I am now. Probably maybe a couple of other guys or gals. I'm going to get a seed run on funding. And by the way, in what we do, at least for building product companies that are venture funded, there are multiple rounds of funding that you'll have to get. Each round is associated with achieving certain set of milestones. And those are reasonably well known and understood by the community. So there's this formula, if you will, that you're going to be aligning your business to. And each stage of this formula, you're going to say, okay, well, I need to hire a team of developers. I'm going to be the chief salesperson and marketing, and do all the back office. By the way, the CEO has to start with the hardest job in the world. And then perhaps a product manager. And then as we get that seed round, we start to hit the milestone. Then I can achieve enough progress that I can get a Series A round of investment, which is multiple millions of dollars. And that allows me to build that infrastructure for a software business, which would include QA, some sales engineering support, and probably 2 or 3 sales professionals that have come from your industry that can help you sort of demonstrate that, yeah, we're able to, not only there's a market there, but not only that we're able to sell to it, but also that we're able to support those customers successfully so that they renew, and all the assumptions of this business plan make sense. So the only thing I need to do at the end of that is to raise more capital and hire more salespeople. And so it's really kind of a simple framework for building a company, and it's not, it isn't rocket science, but it may not be something you've been exposed to. So we make sure, I will make sure that you get exposed to that and get a sense of, okay, well, if I'm going to have this vision for my business over 5 years and have an
Exit is.
Sell a company or go public at a valuation that my venture investors are going to want. This is what the company is going to look like from now over the next 5 year period.
How do you know if your product idea is better as open source, free, or as
It's a really good question. It's a great question. Others?
So, they're not always mutually exclusive, by the way. And I think Marty Resch with Snort and SourceFire is probably one example of somebody who walked that balance and tried to do good things on both sides, if that makes sense. I don't think that they're necessarily sides, but you know what I'm saying. So I think at the end of the day, it winds up being pretty similar to this gentleman's question, which is, what's the market? If it's really, and I don't want to use a buzzword, but if it's really innovative, if you're really approaching the problem in a different way, or you're really getting better results than the things that you get now, that you can get today are giving you, there may be an argument for a business there for 2 reasons. One is that that's an definition of an opportunity, but 2, it may be that to get the resources to really take it to where it should be, that's actually the easiest way to do it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with open sourcing a product, and in fact, we're all using this stuff every day in everything, but
And the gentleman to your right
is doing it right now. But there is, if you looked at, there was one study I had seen, and I don't claim to be the authority on this, that said that the vast majority of open source projects were not maintained past 1 year. You don't want to be one of those because it means people aren't using it. Or if they're using it, they may be using it, but it's not getting better. And having, yeah, well, yeah, or somebody else might take your thing and go do it, right? That happens, so that's another argument. So at the end of the day, it really does come down to validation of the user, but from the users. And you know, if you talk to your community, your peers, your colleagues, your customers, and you get a lot of feedback that says, you know, that would be a really good thing, I would say, think about whether or not a business could support taking it to where you really want that solution to go, because, you know, by definition, the business is sort of the container into which you put resources. Do we have a question here?
So I guess one of the things I would really hope to that is not knowing my competition and like the overwhelming task of researching my competition. And yeah, I validated my market presence and I validated the need and everything, but when I don't know what I don't know, that's a problem. And how do I, like, what is it to figure out that my product is great and running, but there's this other person who does a very similar thing for a cheaper price and they're more widely known, and how do I figure that out?
Can I respond?
Sure.
So, if you don't mind, so I think it's important to know, to understand your competition, and for an early stage, if it is a early market segment, so the market segment isn't mature, don't fret too much over the fact that someone else might be first mover. In fact, for many of us, that might be better if CO3 is basically spending all of its money on Gartner to create the space for you to actually move in and be second mover or better, you know, for example, could be a reasonably good strategy, right? Yes. Like that one. But it is important for you to understand two things. One, how the customer thinks about you, or what bucket, what bin of his budget you're going to fit into, because if you can't describe that, and he doesn't have budget for that, your sales cycle just went from maybe 3 to 6 months to 12 to 18 months. You're going to have to go through a budgeting cycle, which bites.
If you're a new strange thing.
If you're a new strange thing, he's going to have to, you know, or she's going to have to make the case to management that I need money for this thing. So that part is important. And the second part is every one of your initial early adopter customers, when you're making your first pitch, are going to say, who's your competition and how are you different? If you can't answer that question, then they're going to think you don't understand what you're doing.
And your investors definitely will. So if you ever find yourself in a situation with an institutional investor like a venture capitalist, and they ask you, who's your competition? And you say, we have no competition, go home, because your meeting is over.
There are great resources that are out there. You know, for our entrepreneurs, we do leverage Gartner because
Gartner
is an industry analyst organization. It's probably the most highly used, at least by large enterprises, to vet new security spaces, and we actually do all spaces.
So if I may, they do two things. So they kind of play to two audiences. So big companies pay them to hear about what is new and useful and cool and might solve my problem. And vendor companies, security product companies pay them to understand who else is in this space, where's the space going, and how the customers buy. So they have this interesting role that they kind of get to sit on both sides of the fence. But they produce all of this content, some of which you may have seen. They do a thing called Magic Quadrants, where they'll take like a particular sector, like, you know, IDS or firewalls or endpoint protection or whatever, and they'll try to plot both on kind of price and capability where all these companies fall, to help customers understand that. it's expensive to work with them, but they also, when you're a startup company, are the folks you talk to start seeding the customers with the idea that this thing may be coming. So that is part of the other function. Did we have a question?
Yeah, just calling up on gardeners thousands of dollars to get access to their information if you're just exploring an idea.
So I'll tell you what I do. Two things around competitive analysis. One is, usually when you're starting, you don't have thousands of dollars to spend on it. So there's this thing called the internet, and you can find old, so all these analysts, it's fascinating, they write these reports and they cost like $5,000 the day they come out, and the price goes down and down and down until it becomes free. So the ones that are 3 years old are actually out there and you can read them, but when you start searching, you'll find other companies' presentation decks, slide decks that quote all these other reports that they did pay thousands of dollars for. And so if they're cited, it's a data point. You might want to try and double check it, but I'm a firm believer in not paying too much if you don't have to early on, because I can see, 2 years ago, these people said this was going to be the next thing, and they were right, and this applies to me this way. The other thing, when you're doing competitive analysis, your competition is not just other companies that do exactly what you do. Your competition is anything your customer might spend money on that's not you. And so do we have a question in the back here?
I wanted to add something to that. You can usually get those Gartner reports for free. Like if one comes out, let's say, the current month, just by going to one of the companies that's going to be on that chart and saying that you're interested in the product, they'll give you the full report just for giving your email. So you don't have to spend thousands of dollars when you can just, say, okay, I'm interested, here's my email, and you'll get a full report in your inbox, and you'll have every company's rating right there.
Very good point, thank you.
Yeah, the other thing I would also add is that there are other industry analysts that are out there as well. Many of them we have a good relationship with. You're familiar with Superosis or one group. There are, and it's their job to understand what's on the cutting edge that's coming down the pipe, and they'll talk. And that's a great opportunity to get to solicit feedback about, okay, well, how am I? I've told you what I do. How do I position it against what you're aware of that's in the market? And they'll have that conversation with you. It's part of sort of the give and take of their business. Next question. Any more? Yes, sir.
So I guess how do you determine if you've got so if you've got, I guess, a new idea, I don't know, something brand new, how do you determine where you fit and what your market is?
So one is to look at the stuff at the analyst stuff out there to see how they divide the universe. That's actually there are a lot of answers to that question, but the bottom line is see if there is a bin or a category that's already defined. Understand that if you want to create a new one, that is sometimes it can absolutely be the right thing, and sometimes that's the only choice, but that is a long slog because you have to win over the analysts to understanding that A, they haven't been representing the universe of things effectively, and B, they need to basically double their workload to write about a new space. Sometimes that's the right thing. I would say look really hard at what's been published and what's out there, and the positioning of other companies that are doing something around it, and see where they've been placed by the analysts and customers in terms of categories, and then think really hard whether it really is a new category. And there's not a right answer to that. It could be that there's a category you want to fit into because you're just so much different and so much more awesome, but don't look don't look too unusual that you could do that. That saves you some time and trouble and money. At the same time, sometimes, you know what, it's radically different. It's a big bet. I'll give you a good example. Gartner has a new category called endpoint detection and response, which is all of the stuff that's not antivirus because we didn't have another name for it, like FireEye, right? So all these people started putting things on the wire that were trying to care about the endpoint, but it's not the endpoint. So they had to create a whole new category for that. So sometimes it happens after you've put yourself out there with your solution and people have seen it and have said, you know, this is silly. They shouldn't be calling this IPS, right? This is something else. Well, yeah, there is that too.
We had one more question, and it's better be.
I just wanted to say something, which is I moved from Rochester, New York to be part of this program, and I struggled a lot with, you know, they take a little bit of your equity, there's conditions and term sheets and all those things, but at the end of the day, like the value that they provided me, and I'm only 7 weeks in, is just, it's mind-blowing. The network of people that partners have is awesome. The people that they're putting in front of us have like legit credibility in the industry, and it's like a whole other master's degree in like 7 weeks. So, you know, when you talk about you know, hacking your business, like they're providing us the tools to like, you know, figure out what we need to do to be successful. So if you guys, you know, aren't sure, these are the people to talk to really to figure out if it makes sense to, you know, chase this dream that you have. Thanks.
Thank you, JP. I appreciate that. So one thing I did want to say, because the last thing in the world, we enjoy talking to people who are really early and thinking about it and trying to figure out if there's a thing there. So one thing I would say is, like, whether you're interested in the program or not, I'm happy to talk to anybody about how this works, because I personally found it really fun. But the one thing I'll say is, if you have not looked at the body of information out there saying that CISOs and security people are not being taken seriously within their large organizations because they're not navigating being able to articulate the issues and things like this, there's a professional development aspect here. And whether you do it by starting your own company or whether you do it by just trying to learn about business, I think that the most effective security people are those who can communicate to their customer in a way their customer can understand. And sometimes it's going to be a little different than the way that maybe we communicate to each other. And I know that sounds really obvious, but apparently this is an issue even for CISOs. And so part of, yeah, you know, professionalism matters. So, you know, part of why we're doing this is that we think that it's a professional development issue for the InfoSec community to understand how business works. I personally think the best way to do that is by starting your own, but that's just my preference and my risk tolerance, and I know not everybody shares that. So I would encourage you, regardless, to think a little bit about the business that you're supporting, because, you know, security is an enabler.